Hello and welcome to Traditional Painting the Digital Way. This is where I use digital painting apps to teach traditional painting techniques. This is part 4 in our Forest Path series, and in this video we're going to go ahead and add some more detail to the trees and add some light effects and work on the underbrush and the road. If you want to follow along traditionally, check out part 1 in this series where I have a list of all the paint and brushes and the canvases that I use. The app that I'm going to be using is Infinite Painter for Android. And here we're going to go ahead and continue working a little bit on the leaves and the edges of the highlights of the leaves and try to get a little bit of a little bit more detailed look on some of the edges of the leaves. And you want to go ahead and use kind of a lighter color here. And you want to work on the edge of the tree trunks as well. Here I'm working on the tree trunks and trying to add a light edge on them, but don't make all the trunk that one color. You want to just kind of add the edge there where the sun is hitting it and the sun rays are shining on it. And you also want to use kind of cadmium orange light maybe, or a lightish yellow. If you're following along traditionally, you would use cadmium orange light with white acrylic gesso. And maybe throw in a little bit of yellow if you want to. But that just works well for a highlight color against a burnt umber or a burnt sienna. And you want to make the edges of the trees kind of uneven and sort of jagged looking. The highlight will cover some of the rough bark, so it's not going to be a straight line. You want a broken line whenever you're highlighting the edges of the tree stump. And so here this tree is right in the foreground, and you want to kind of give it a rough look for the bark. You want to show the pockets of dark and light, and that show that it has kind of a rough bark on it. And you might use a little bit of a darker orange, not quite as much white added into it if you're following along traditionally. And you would take your liner brush and you could smudge it with your finger, or you can use your number 6 round or something and just kind of use a dry brush technique. And here I'm adding some of that orange I put on the trees on the road again to make it look more like the sunbeams are shining through it. It's going to hit the edge of that road the brightest on the left side because it's shining from the upper right corner in your painting. So it's going to hit from the edges of your road there and make them look lighter, and also across your road. But again, you don't want a solid orange line, or you want a softened edge, and you want a broken line so that it looks like the trees are casting shadows on the road and that the sun is shining through the gaps in the trees. And here I'm adding some on the other side of the painting, the right side, where there's going to be some of the light shining through the foliage there and through the gaps on the trees on the right side as well. And so most of the front is going to be in shadow, so it's not going to have as bright of an orange color, but you can put a little bit of orange there just to give it a sort of a color continuity, and also just give it a little bit of a highlight. Not quite as bright as you would where the sunbeams are shining through, but a little bit, just a dab of it. And so I'm still working on that and working on softening the edges of the orange. You want to make sure that you don't get too much of a hard edge there. And I'm adding a little bit of a grayish color back to the road, and then a little bit I'm working on the trees, and I'm adding a little bit of a lighter brown in the middle of the trees, and that just kind of gives it more of a rounded look because you're adding it right next to the highlight color, so it's like it's reflected light off of the highlight, but it's not the complete shadow, but it gives it the form of a tree, the rounded form, and so that it looks round and three-dimensional and not near as flat. And so I'm just kind of adding that to the trees on the right side as well, just to give it more depth and more form and give it a three-dimensional look. Painting is kind of like magic. It's sort of an illusion. You have to figure out how to, when a magician does his tricks, he has these illusions that he does, and so you have to add little illusions to your paintings to do these things, tricks with colors and light and dark and things like that. Excuse me, things like that. And so then here I've got the leaves. I'm working a little bit more on a few of the leaves on the right side. They're more in shadow and they're not getting as much light, but they get a little bit of the light. So I'm working on that. And then I want to go ahead and just add a little bit also on the ground, because there's some grass and different kinds of weeds and plants and things like that that are growing at the foot of the trees, and you want to put that around your trees because that helps settle them down and makes them look like they're not floating, that they're attached to the ground, and that grass has grown up around them. And so I'm adding a little bit of some grass sprigs and clumps around the bottom of the tree on the right side. And this is in the foreground, so they can look a little bit more detailed. You want to add a little bit more individual looking sprigs of grass and things like that, and some indications of maybe flowers, maybe just some kind of bushes, something that grows right there in the forest. And so I'm adding a little bit more of the grass along the edges of the road, because it's going to have some grass growing on the edges of the road in the dirt clumps there. And then I wanted to add a little bit more color and work on the shape of the leaves on the trees on the foreground type there, and just try to get them a little bit brighter there and work on their shape a little bit. And a little bit more to the trees on the right at the top where the sunbeams are shining through, and just try to get that look of sun rays shining through the trees there. And then I added a little bit more light green to the spaces between the trees on the right, and that just makes it look like you're at the edge of the forest, and that's where all the sunlight is shining through. That just sort of opens it up right there and gives it a more three-dimensional look as well. It looks like you're looking through the trees and seeing a little bit of the land that's out beyond the forest. And then I wanted to add a few more light leaves to the trees on the left side, and use some of the splatter brushes. They're helpful to give a look for individual trees, and if you're following along traditionally, individual tree leaves. If you're following along traditionally, you could use your number 3 round brush and just kind of make little comma shapes to represent the edges of the leaves, and sort of put them on in maybe a zigzag type of pattern. You want them to kind of connect, but you don't want just individual dots. You want little jagged comma shapes that connect together. And so that's what I'm trying to get across here, and just add a little bit more of the highlight color, trying to get it a little bit brighter, and get things to look like the sunbeams are hitting them. And this is what you do for the final details and the final contrast. And again, you want all the light contrast to be in the front. You want the back to look sort of faded out and indistinct because of the arrow perspective, where things are more faded in the back. And then things are clearer and more intense in color as they get closer to you. So you want to go ahead and just kind of step back and look at it and see what you think, and see if you need to add a little bit more detail. Look at how the shapes of the leaves are doing. Look at if they're going over the path correctly, and if it's giving it a 3-dimensional look, you just go ahead and do a step back. Or if you're doing this digitally, of course, you can zoom it. You can zoom it, or you can make it smaller, and that will kind of give you an idea of what it looks like at a distance as well. And so here I'm just kind of adding a little bit of some darker leaves back on the right side, just to kind of give a look of some shadows on the top of the painting there, kind of get the darker leaves back in. Sometimes you just have to go back and forth and add pockets of dark and light, and just try to work on that contrast and work on the shapes of the leaves, and just make them look a little bit more precise in the front, the foreground. You want to do this in the foreground. And then here I wanted to add a little bit more of dark back in the painting in certain places, on the shadows of the trunks and things like that, just to give it more of a contrast, and make the tree stumps have some more shadow and look like they have a little bit more detail. Again, you want the detail in the front and not in the background of the picture. And so here I can tell that it's shaping up pretty good, that it's got more detail in the front, and the back is looking more indistinct, and so it's giving it a more 3-dimensional look than if we had gone with the painting, the photograph that in part 1, where we looked at the first photograph that was really busy and had lots of leaves, and you really couldn't get much depth to it. This is a much better way to show leaves and a tree path, but it's just not overkilled with detail like the first picture. And so here I'm just kind of working on the shapes of the leaves and the path, and trying to get the edge light right on the leaves and things like that, and trying to get them a little bit more clear. We just want a little bit more detail, and I'm working on the shape of them a little bit more on the left side, just trying to get a little bit more clarity, just a little bit more close-up detail. And then I'm working a little bit more on the foliage at the bottom of the trees, trying to settle them down and make them look like they're not floating, and they're more settled into the dirt and the ground, and that just adds to the painting, and maybe a little bit of the green. It might actually be some moss. You want to might want to add a little moss to your trees. Just it depends, of course, on where your painting is as to whether you have moss on trees. If you're in a dry climate, you don't, but if you're in sort of a wet climate, the little moss gives it a nice look there. And then I'm trying to add a little bit of some rocks on the ground, and a little bit of dirt clumps, and some indications of twigs and things like that, and then adding a little bit of some blue color to the shadows just to give it more of a shadow look in the front, but maybe not make it quite as dark as the original reference photo, but I do want it to have a shadow look, so I'm adding some of the shadow color there, and just kind of doing some of the last details. And so there's one more part to this. There's part 5 where I add all the final details to this and add the sunbeams. So if you want to see how to add the sunbeams, hit the subscribe button. And thanks everybody for watching. Thank you so much for your support. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments down below, and I will catch you later.